In this podcast, we're going to talk about Thomas the Slav, who was a Byzantine commander in the 9th century AD, and he had a very interesting career. Now, Thomas was born in 760 AD, in northern modern-day Turkey, on the southern edge of the Black Sea. Now, like many young individuals in the Byzantine Empire, he joined the army and eventually rose through the ranks and became a staff officer. Now, from an early standpoint, Thomas formed a very close association with two future emperors, Leo the Armenian and Michael II. He actually was Michael the Amorian at that time. He became the future emperor. As the future emperor, he was referred to as Michael II. So he formed a very close association with him, and they were all in the Byzantine army. Now, in 813 AD, Leo the Armenian became emperor. And he did what most emperors do. They quickly reward their old companions. And he gave them very, very important military commands over elite military forces. Michael received a command, and Thomas was made commander of the very powerful Foederati. So they basically had achieved a huge amount of success through their close association with Leo the Armenian. Now, it wasn't uncommon in those days in the Byzantine court there was a lot of intrigue. I guess that's the best way to say it. A lot of treachery, a lot of assassinations, a lot of rebellions. That wasn't really uncommon. And basically, your old friends could turn on you on a dime because everybody wanted to be emperor. Especially when you rose through the ranks, you paid your dues. There was a lot of competition to become emperor, kind of similar to the 1st century AD with ancient Rome, when Julius Caesar, all of these various individuals are trying to seize power. So that's where things stood in 813. Now, Leo was emperor for approximately 7 years. And then on Christmas Day in 820, he was assassinated in the palace chapel. And this was organized by his close friend, Michael the Amorian. Michael was then quickly crowned emperor, and he was known from that point on as Michael II. So out of these three friends, one of them now is dead. And around this same time, Thomas launched a rebellion in Asia Minor, that part of the Byzantine Empire. Now, this is where the exact chronology becomes a little murky. It's not exactly known what Thomas's motives were. Was he starting a rebellion because Leo was assassinated, or was he just trying to seize the throne for himself? Well, in my opinion, he probably was trying to seize the throne for himself. This was not really a rebellion. This was a competition between two claimants for the throne. Now, Thomas was extremely popular in Asia Minor. So almost all of the army there, except for a few units, defected to Thomas. So he enjoyed widespread support. So much so that the caliphate in the south had to deal with Thomas. They actually gave him, they set up a meeting with him. And basically both sides agreed not to attack each other, and they formed not really an alliance, but a treaty that neither side would attack each other. And it's not exactly known if Thomas gave some concessions to the caliphate. That's not exactly known, but he was allowed to recruit Arabs into his cause. And also there was some other issues here. I think that the caliphate was more than happy to see a civil war taking place. This was a massive civil war. So they probably weren't too upset about this. As far as they were concerned, this wasn't a problem for them. These two sides could have it out, and it would only serve to weaken the Byzantine Empire. Now, Michael, of course, didn't waste any time, and he launched an attack against Thomas, but it failed. And so in the summer of 821, Thomas decided to consolidate his position in the east. And so, some of the areas that had held out, that eluded his control, he took possession of those. And Michael was really in a position to do nothing about them. His army had already suffered a defeat. So Michael consolidated his position in Europe. So really, he had two areas of control: Asia Minor, that whole area, and Syria. Those portions of the empire were controlled by Thomas, and Michael controlled Constantinople, the all-important capital, as well as Macedonia, Thrace. All of those areas in Europe were under his control. Michael did retain control of the very powerful imperial fleet, and that was important. And that was stationed at Constantinople. But Thomas had the larger land army, so you also had that dynamic as well. So after Thomas basically took control of all of Asia Minor, he began to, his ultimate prize was Constantinople. But in order to take that, that was one of the most well-defended cities in the world. So Thomas assembled troops, he gathered supplies, and built siege machines because he knew this would be a very long siege of Constantinople. It wasn't going to be by any means an easy fight. And he also, as I said, had a very large army. Some accounts put it at 80,000 men, while Michael's army was considerably, almost half those numbers. It numbered in around 40,000, but he had control of Constantinople. Like I said, that was so it was much easier. Just a few thousand defenders could defend the city. It had the most extensive set of defenses in the world at that time. The wall, the very famous tiered wall of Constantinople, not an easy endeavor for Thomas. Nonetheless, Thomas finally landed in Europe, and he was actually welcomed with quite a bit of enthusiasm. And so Michael was finally forced to withdraw to Constantinople. He no longer even had control of Macedonia or Thrace. Now he was just resigned to the city. But as I said, he had still control of the all-important imperial fleet, so he could continue to ferry in supplies as he needed them. Thomas also constructed his own fleet, but it was in no way, it was a much smaller fleet, but in no way could that compete with the imperial fleet. But as I said before, he had a much larger land army, so that was essentially the state of affairs. Now, fortunately for Michael, the citizens and the army that was inside Constantinople remained very loyal to Michael II. They remained loyal to the emperor. Despite the fact that they were under siege now from this massive force, there wasn't really any revolt or any issues inside Constantinople. The garrison, again, was firmly behind Michael. So basically, Thomas decided to seize the smaller towns basically around Constantinople. And then what he did was he brought up all of his heavy siege equipment, and the siege began in earnest. Each of Thomas's attacks, however, failed. The defenders' artillery was superior, and they were able to keep Thomas's siege engines far away from the land walls. So this siege was not exactly successful in the beginning, and it just dragged on and on. There was sort of a stalemate, and as the winter set in, Thomas had to suspend all further attacks until the spring, and so he withdrew his army to winter quarters. Michael used this time wisely, the sort of break in the war, and he ferried in additional reinforcements and also repaired some of the walls that had been damaged during the first siege. And when Thomas returned in the spring, he decided to start the offensive once again. And once again, the siege failed. And it was Thomas's army, they just could not penetrate the defenses. As much as they tried, there was just no chance of that happening. It was, as I said, the citizens and the army in Constantinople remained highly loyal, and they were able to eventually drive back Thomas's army. At the same time, the imperial fleet also defeated Thomas's much smaller fleet, and their crews, Thomas's crews, broke and fled to the shore in panic. They were soundly defeated. So this, Thomas's naval strength was already much weaker, and now it was effectively wiped out. So again, Michael could continue to ferry in supplies from the sea. Now, Thomas still remained in control of a very sizable army, so he could blockade the capital by land, but again, he could do nothing in terms of of a naval blockade. So these losses from Thomas demoralized his supporters, and defections began. That was a problem now from this point on. He started to lose some of his supporters. Not all. I mean, the army still stayed basically loyal, but there were several that began to desert. At some point, Thomas won a very minor victory, but he exploited it for all that it was worth, and he requested Greece support his position and demanded ships. He needed more ships because he wanted to actually launch a new attack against Constantinople, which would basically be a land and sea assault. So he was able to secure around 350 vessels. And with these reinforcements, he launched again a two-pronged assault against Constantinople's sea walls. Michael, however, did not remain dormant, and he ordered the imperial fleet to launch their own attack against the rebel vessels. And they used Greek fire and were able to destroy or capture most of Thomas's ships. Just a few managed to escape and rejoin Thomas's forces. So through this victory, Michael now secured complete control of the sea, but Thomas's army still remained superior on land. So there was again this continued sort of dynamic going on. So he was able to continue at least the land blockade of Constantinople. So for the rest of the war, really you had minor skirmishes between both sides. So again, like this sort of stalemate ensued, where neither side was able to gain a decisive advantage. So Michael, he really wanted to end this war. So he turned to the empire's northern neighbor, Bulgaria, and asked them for help. Now, Bulgaria was actually bound by a 30-year treaty signed under Leo V, and so he was sort of obligated to help. And he actually responded to Michael's request for assistance, and he had no problem with that. He decided to go ahead and send some reinforcements, and so the Bulgarian army invaded Thrace, probably in 822 AD, somewhere around there, and they advanced towards Constantinople. Now, Thomas realized he certainly couldn't maintain the siege with a large army heading his direction. So he broke off the siege and marched to meet the Bulgarian army. And the two armies met. And the accounts here are very different too, the sources. One has it that Thomas lost the battle, and another one states that he won the battle. He was able to defeat the Bulgarians, but his forces suffered heavy casualties. In any event, his army was never really the same, and the few remnants that were left of his fleet were forced to surrender to Michael, as he was no longer at Constantinople. So Thomas still, though, decided to, he still wanted to keep up the rebellion, so he set up camp about 25 miles away from Constantinople. And he spent the winter there. Though, as I said, his army now had been severely battered by in the battle against the Bulgarians. So again, he started to face some desertions. But it's important to note, though, the bulk of his army still remained loyal. Though he was, there were some stragglers starting to defect to Michael. But with his string of victories, Michael definitely held the initiative. And in May or April of 823, he marched his army out against Thomas. But by this time, Thomas's army was demoralized. They were just getting tired of this ongoing war that seemed to have no end in sight. And now that Michael was in clearly the dominant position, many units started surrendering en masse to Michael, while others fled, in whatever direction they could. Thomas himself sought refuge in a smaller city with his adopted son. Michael, well, let me explain it this way. There were some cities that remained loyal to Thomas. So Michael effectively organized sieges but he actually didn't launch any assaults on these cities. He didn't want to destroy them. They were, after all, part of the empire. He didn't want to, forcibly go in there and start laying waste to these cities. So he simply opted for a strategy where he wanted to wear them out by just surrounding them and cutting them off. And this also would, he wouldn't be attacking Christians. That would also look bad in terms of propaganda. So Michael wanted to sort of, I think he knew by this point he was going to win the war, and he certainly didn't want to present his his rule in any bad way. So again, Thomas's some of these cities held out, but eventually those cities were forced to submit to the emperor, and eventually Thomas was finally captured by Michael and quickly executed. And I think they also captured his stepson as well. He was also executed. So this massive rebellion that took place was finally defeated, and Michael II was able to throw a triumph, and that's what you always do, right? After you win a big victory. So in May of 824 in Constantinople, he held a triumph, and he was actually, like I said before, he wanted to unify the empire again. So he was, how do I say this? He was very, although he executed some of Thomas's main supporters, for the most part, he pardoned and quite a few of them, and allowed them, what he did was just ship them off to remote parts of the empire. That was actually standard procedure. After a civil war, you won the civil war, you would ship everybody out to the very remote parts of the frontier, but he didn't execute them. So they were just exiled again, but he didn't execute them because he really wanted to unify the empire. So that was it for Thomas's rebellion. It's one of the more famous rebellions in Byzantine history. Thanks as always for listening to the podcast.